All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a really pivotal moment in history. That's the early days of European colonization here in North America. You sent us some excerpts from the American Yawp. It's that online collaborative history textbook.
Right.
And we're really looking at not just the who landed where, but that clash of cultures, right? That happened when Europeans and Native Americans first met.
Exactly. That's what makes this period so fascinating, you know? It's a more nuanced look at history.
For sure.
We're talking about like the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English all trying to kind of carve out their own space in this new world.
Right.
And how they interacted with the Native Americans who were already there, well, that's what we're going to be looking at all the way from the late 15th century up to the early 1700s.
Yeah, it's a big chunk of time. And you know what's interesting? There's this idea out there that the Dutch were kind of the good guys of colonization. We're going to see if that holds up.
I'll definitely put that to the test because no group was entirely innocent, that's for sure.
No, definitely not. Okay, so rewind with me, late 1400s, early 1500s. The Spanish, they're the first Europeans to really make a splash, right? I mean, they were driven by gold, glory, all that stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, think about conquistadors like Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro.
Oh, yeah.
They were lured by, those riches, the Aztec and Inca empires, and they weren't exactly known for being, what's the word?
No,
Typical.
not at all. I mean, we're talking about massacres, like the one at Acoma Pueblo, hundreds of people killed, women, children.
Right, right.
And then you've got the forced labor, the spread of disease. It's a pretty dark chapter.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just isolated incidents, the impact of the Spanish approach in places like Florida, it just decimated the native population. Imagine a population of, say, 150,000 to 300,000 people.
Wow.
And then over 250 years, it's reduced to just a fraction of that. Disease, violence, it's just devastating.
It's hard to even comprehend. So all this brutality, it leads to what historians call the Black Legend, right?
Exactly. That's it. The Black Legend. It was this narrative spread by other European powers that really played up the cruelty of the Spanish.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it was used to condemn Spain, obviously. But then, ironically, other European powers used it to justify their own colonization. Like, we're not as bad as the Spanish. We can do this better, more humanely.
Right, right. It's almost like a PR campaign, isn't it? We might be colonizers, but at least we're not as bad as those guys.
Yeah, it definitely had that element to it. But the Black Legend's impact went beyond just propaganda. It shaped how Europeans thought about their role in the New World.
It's fascinating how these narratives take hold. Okay, so let's move north a bit to the French. Now, they were more into the fur trade than, say, outright conquest, right?
That's right, yeah. For the French, it was all about those beaver pelts. But that meant they needed to cooperate, at least to some degree, with Native Americans.
So instead of immediate conquest, they're forming partnerships.
Yep.
And even like intermarrying, creating this whole new group of people, the Metis.
Exactly. And that's a completely different dynamic than what we saw with the Spanish, right?
Oh, for sure.
It's what historians call the middle ground, a space where both the French and Native Americans adapted to each other's practices, for mutual benefit. Think about it. To get those furs, the French had to learn to navigate all those intricate social and political systems of the Native Americans.
Does that make sense?
Customs, languages, it was a whole new world for them.
But it wasn't all just peace and harmony, was it? I mean, this cooperation, wasn't it driven by economic necessity?
Absolutely. The French were pragmatists, no doubt about it. They knew that to maintain that profitable fur trade, they had to keep those relationships with Native Americans strong.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's talk about the Dutch. They often get painted as the more tolerant, freedom-loving group in this whole colonial story, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
And they were all about trade, making money, right?
Yeah, that was the image they projected, and to a certain extent, it was true. They were less interested in conquering huge swaths of land and more focused on setting up profitable trading posts, like New Netherland.
Right. But what about that whole purchase of Manhattan? The story where they supposedly bought it from the Munsee for, like, a handful of beads and trinkets?
Oh, right. Well, that story, it's more complicated than that. Likely, the Munsee had a different understanding of what land ownership meant.
Interesting.
It might have been more about sharing access to resources than that, permanent ownership in the European sense.
So, like, a fundamental misunderstanding right from the start about what it even means to own land. But we still hear that story about the Dutch buying Manhattan.
It's a classic example of how history can be oversimplified and romanticized, for sure.
Okay, so the Dutch were big on trade, but they were also involved in the slave trade, right?
That's true.
And that doesn't exactly scream tolerant or freedom-loving, does it?
It's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? You're right. They talked about liberty, but they were deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Actually, New Amsterdam, by 1660, had the biggest urban enslaved population in North America.
Hold on. The Dutch, who were supposedly all about freedom, had the biggest enslaved population.
It highlights just how complex and contradictory history can be.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, right? Early Dutch slavery wasn't always as rigid as it would become later. Enslaved Africans in New Amsterdam could actually sue for back wages, and some even got partial freedom.
So there were these glimmers of something like rights or freedoms, but still,
Yeah.
they were enslaved. This is a very messy part of their history.
Absolutely. It raises questions about how those seemingly progressive ideals coexisted with exploitation and injustice. It's a tough one to reconcile.
All right, welcome back to our deep dives into early North American history. You know, it's kind of wild to think about how those early encounters between Europeans and Native Americans,
Yeah.
how much of a lasting impact they had. It's like they shaped the entire fabric of this nation, right?
Yeah. It really is like a chain reaction. I mean, each decision, every interaction, it sets off these events that ripple through time, you know?
Totally. So we've talked about the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch, but let's get back to those English colonies, especially Jamestown. It's like the ultimate underdog story.
Well, yeah, Jamestown, it's a really fascinating case study. It's got everything: ambition, hardship, and ultimately, resilience. Remember those early colonists? The ones who thought they'd find easy riches in the New World, those gentlemen adventurers.
Oh, yeah, they were in for a big surprise. I mean, disease, starvation, conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. It's hard to believe they even survived.
It really is. And the starving time, well, it's a pretty grim chapter. I mean, there's archaeological evidence that suggests they even resorted to cannibalism to survive.
Wow, that's intense.
It just shows you how desperate they were, how fragile life was in those early colonies. They were willing to do just about anything to survive.
I can't even imagine. But then along comes tobacco,
Okay.
and it changes everything.
It does. Tobacco. The thing that King James I called a noxious weed, It ended up becoming Virginia's economic engine, fueled the colony's growth, brought in more settlers looking for a share of the profits.
It's kind of crazy how one plant could have that much of an impact.
Yeah.
But it also fueled the demand for labor, right? I mean, who was doing all that work on those tobacco plantations?
That's the key question, isn't it? In the beginning, they relied mostly on indentured servants. These were people who agreed to work for a certain number of years in exchange for passage to the New World.
Oh, great.
But as the demand for labor kept growing, they turned to something much more permanent, more exploitative African slavery.
So then, in 1619, a Dutch ship shows up in Virginia. It's carrying 20 enslaved Africans. That's a huge moment in history, right? A turning point.
It is, absolutely.
It really is. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and head up north to New England. Remember the Puritans we talked about? They were driven by a totally different vision, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, they were all about creating this godly society, like a beacon of light in this world they saw as corrupt. Think city on a hill, that phrase from John Winthrop's sermon.
Oh, right. So they weren't just looking for religious freedom. They wanted to build a whole model society based on their interpretation of the Bible.
Exactly. They were all about community, hard work, strict moral codes. And unlike Virginia, which was mostly single men looking for fortune, New England attracted families, people wanting a new life built on faith and community.
It's interesting how those different types of people shaped those regions, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even in that city on a hill, there were some problems, weren't there? I mean, they weren't exactly known for being tolerant of different views.
That's true, yeah. Their whole quest for religious purity ended up leading to persecution of anyone who didn't agree with them. Like, think about Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams.
Right.
They were banished from Massachusetts because they challenged the Puritan leaders.
And then there's the Salem witch trials, right? Driven by fear, paranoia, religious extremism. It just goes to show you, even societies founded on these high ideals, they can fall victim to irrationality and injustice.
For sure. And it also shows you how power can be abused, especially when religion gets mixed in to justify persecution.
Okay, let's go back to Virginia for a minute. I want to talk about Pocahontas. I mean, her story has basically become American folklore, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. The whole tale of Pocahontas, though it's been romanticized, often kind of distorted over time.
Right.
There's definitely evidence that she played a role in mediating between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy, but her story often gets used to portray Native Americans as these noble savages, It reinforces this narrative of European superiority.
So it sounds like the real story is a lot more complicated, less Disney-fied than the version we often hear.
Hmm.
We have to be careful about those historical narratives, right? How they get shaped by cultural biases and how we often just want to have these simple, feel-good stories.
Exactly. We need to be critical when we look at historical figures to understand how their stories have been filtered through time and different cultural perspectives.
And speaking of narratives, remember that Black legend we talked about earlier? That whole propaganda campaign about how brutal the Spanish were? It's interesting how other European powers use that to their advantage.
Oh, yeah, it was a powerful tool for the English. It let them position themselves as the more, benevolent colonizers, even while they were doing their own exploiting and violence.
So almost like this PR battle, right?
Hmm.
Each European power trying to control how they were seen, putting themselves in the best light possible.
It just shows you how history is often written by the winners, how whoever controls the story gets to shape how we see and remember things.
For sure. Now, we've been focusing a lot on the European colonizers, but we got to remember that Native Americans weren't just sitting back passively during all this. They have their own cultures, beliefs, ways of life.
Absolutely. Native American societies, they were complex, diverse. They had their own governments, social structures, spiritual beliefs, and they had their own ways of interacting with the land. They didn't just stand by and watch as Europeans took over their territory.
They resisted, right? I mean, in different ways through diplomacy, trade, alliances, even armed conflict.
They did in lots of ways, from small acts of defiance to full-on uprisings. They fought hard to protect their lands, their cultures, their entire way of life.
But as European colonization just kept gaining momentum, that balance of power shifted, and not in their favor. Disease, weapons, the constant push for land and resources.
Yeah, it all tipped the scales towards the newcomers, and the consequences for Native Americans were absolutely devastating. Widespread death from diseases they had no immunity to, forced off their land, their cultures disrupted. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of colonization.
It really is. Okay, before we get to the last part of our exploration, let's take a moment to just think about what we've learned so far. We've seen how that clash of cultures in early North America, it was complicated, often brutal,
Hmm.
driven by ambition, greed, religious fervor, and even these new ideas about racial superiority.
We've also seen how different European powers went about colonizing, each with their own goals and methods, and how that left a lasting mark on both the land and the people. And we can't forget about considering multiple perspectives, right? The diversity of Native American cultures, their strength in the face of colonization. It's important to see all sides of the story.
It's been a real journey through time. And the next part, we'll dig even deeper into early America. We'll look at how the relationship between the colonists and Native Americans changed, the rise of slavery, and how the seeds of conflict were planted that eventually led to the American Revolution. All right, welcome back to our deep dive. We're on the final part of our look at colliding cultures. It's been a wild ride so far, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, for sure. From those Spanish conquistadors to the fur traders up north, those pragmatic Dutch, and then, of course, the English settlers looking for something new.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how those first encounters, they really did set everything in motion, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And, it wasn't just about different languages and customs clashing, right?
No, not at all.
It was about totally different ways of seeing the world, different ideas about the land, about power, about who's in charge, basically.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head there.
So last we left off, the English were pretty settled in, both down in Virginia and up in New England. Their colonies are doing well, but you got to wonder, as they kept expanding, how did they deal with those relationships with Native Americans?
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? They needed land, they needed resources, they wanted their economy to grow, all of that pushing up against the rights and the way of life of those indigenous peoples.
Right.
It's going to cause friction, right? And that's exactly what happens. Throughout the 1600s, the 1700s, lots of conflict.
Yeah, we're talking full-blown wars, right? Not just little skirmishes. These were brutal. They changed who had power in North America.
Oh, yeah. Like King Philip's War, for example, raged through New England from 1675 to 1676. It was devastating. They called Metacomet King Philip. He was the leader of the Wampanoag. But it wasn't just about land, you know? It was about survival. The Wampanoag and their allies, they were trying to protect their whole way of life from those English settlers.
It's tough reading about those wars, You get caught up in all the battles and the dates, but then you realize how many people died. Colonists, Native Americans, entire communities wiped out.
It really hits home, you know.
Yeah.
That expansion came at a huge cost. And it wasn't just in New England either. Those kinds of conflicts, they were happening all over. Native Americans were being pushed further and further west, their lives disrupted, their populations decimated.
It makes you think about Pocahontas, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How her story, that romanticized version we all know, it kind of glosses over all that tension and the power struggles that were really happening.
It's like they're trying to smooth over those rough edges of history, make it seem like there was this harmony that probably never really existed.
Right, exactly. So while all this is going on, another dark force is taking root: slavery. We talked about those first enslaved Africans arriving in Virginia in 1619, but how did it turn into that horrific system of chattel slavery?
It's important to remember that in the beginning, it wasn't always like that. Those early forms of African servitude, they weren't always so rigid or so tied to race. There was some gray area. Some Africans got their freedom, even owned land.
So it wasn't always like that system in the South where it was permanent, passed down through generation.
Not right away, no. But as those plantations needed more and more workers and racial prejudice got worse, things changed. They made laws to say slaves were property, not people, took away their basic rights.
It's scary how economics and prejudice can work together to create that kind of system where oppression just becomes part of society.
It is, and the effects were huge. By the 1700s, slavery was basically what the South's economy was built on. It affected everything: society, politics, culture. And that legacy, well, we're still dealing with it today.
We are, and as we get closer to the American Revolution, it's important to remember that those colonies weren't all the same.
Yeah.
New England was different from the Mid-Atlantic, which was different from the South. They had different identities, economies, even different cultures.
Right, right.
Did that play into those tensions with Great Britain?
Oh, for sure. Those regional differences mattered. Each colony had its own complaints with how Britain was running things: taxes, trade, representation.
Yeah.
But I think it was that shared experience, being colonized, wanting to govern themselves. That's what brought them together.
But it's kind of strange, right? How those ideas of freedom and equality, which were so important for the Revolution, how they could exist alongside slavery. That's a tough thing to wrap your head around.
It is. It really is. A paradox, right? It shows how complicated and contradictory American history really is. Those ideals, they were powerful, they changed things, but they didn't apply to everyone.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into colliding cultures, it's pretty clear those early encounters between Europeans and Native Americans, they changed everything. The land, the people, even how we think about what it means to be American.
Absolutely. We saw how European, Native American, and African cultures all mixed together create something totally new and complex. Think about it. Our language, the food we eat, our music, art, even how we see ourselves as a nation, it all goes back to those early interactions.
It's a story with good and bad sharing and exploitation, adaptation and resistance. It shows that American culture is always changing, shaped by how different groups of people interact. And you know what? We've only just scratched the surface.
We have, yeah.
But hopefully, this deep dive gave you a new way of looking at those early encounters, got you thinking critically about the stories we tell ourselves about the past, and maybe even inspired you to go out and find those untold stories that help us understand it all better.
I hope so. There's always more to learn.
It's been a heck of a journey, and I hope you'll keep exploring this fascinating period in history. As we've seen, that clash of cultures, it's still happening in a way, right? It's up to us to learn from what's happened before and try to build a future that's fairer and more inclusive for everyone.